I'm Joseph Waligore, and I'm here to talk about a book that presents a new way of looking at deism. Before writing this book, I got a PhD from Syracuse University and taught for 20 years at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Deism was a major movement in the 16 and 1700s, and its most important proponents were such illustrious people as Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Ben Franklin. Nowadays, people say that deism is a belief in a distant and inactive God who never intervenes in the world. In my book, I show that the deists of the Enlightenment period believed God was a caring and loving Father who often helped humanity by intervening in the world. Most importantly, the Enlightenment deists believed God was good and always treated everyone fairly. This book is based on decades of research and thousands of books, pamphlets, and speeches written in the 16 and 1700s. In this research, I found over 500 deists that previous scholars do not know about. While other scholars base their assessment of deism on a dozen or two deists, I base my assessment of deism on over 600 deists. From my research for this book, I also published 4 articles in academic journals about the deists. If we want to understand an intellectual and cultural movement, we have to look at its cultural context and what it was reacting to at its beginning. Deism began in 1624 when Herbert of Cherbury published the first deist book entitled De Veritate, or On Truth. Herbert was not responding to Newtonian science, as it would be over 60 years before Sir Isaac Newton would publish his scientific masterpiece, the Principia Mathematica. Nor was Herbert responding to earlier parts of the scientific revolution, such as the discoveries of Galileo and Kepler, as Herbert still believed in astrology and even praised the ancient art of divination, which is telling the future by various methods, including looking at the entrails of birds. Herbert was also not responding to the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, as he started writing in 1619, and the Enlightenment would not start for decades. When we look at his cultural context, Europe was having its worst religious war ever, the 30 Years' War. To understand why Catholics and Protestants were killing each other during this time, we have to understand the Christianity of this time, because it is very different than mainstream Christianity nowadays. Nowadays, most Christian groups emphasize the second major part of the Bible, which is the New Testament. The New Testament is the story of the life of Jesus and his teachings. Jesus is generally thought to be both human and God at the same time. Jesus was very loving and kind. He did not judge anyone, especially the social outcasts like lepers and those seemingly possessed by demons. Besides the New Testament, there is another major part of the Bible, the Old Testament, which tells the story of people who lived before Jesus. It talks about Adam, Eve, Noah, and Moses. In the 16 and 1700s, Christians emphasized the Old Testament, which presents a very different kind of God than the loving, kind God Jesus talks about in the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is wrathful, jealous, and cruel. Christians of the 16 and 1700s commonly thought only Christians went to heaven. Everyone else was doomed to hell, even if they had never heard about Jesus. Moreover, Protestants thought Catholics were not Christians at all, but heretics. Likewise, the Catholics thought the Protestants were heretics. The Old Testament God had given people a list of commandments, and he punished whole countries for the sins of some people in that country. This God got so disgusted with humanity because of their sinfulness that he made it rain for 40 days and nights until there was so much water that it covered the whole earth, even the mountains. The only people who were left alive were Noah and his family, who survived in an ark. Another time God punished whole cities was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. According to a common interpretation of the Bible, God did not approve of the homosexuality practiced there, and so God rained down fire and brimstone to destroy both cities. Importantly, the Christians of the 16 and 1700s thought God was still wrathful and jealous, like in the Old Testament. He was not tolerant and forgiving like Jesus, or the God Jesus talked about. Christians of this time thought God still punished countries with plagues and earthquakes if people did not obey his commandments. On 9/11, America was attacked, and a few years later, Hurricane Katrina decimated New Orleans. While some Americans claim both of these things were caused by God to punish Americans for allowing supposedly sinful behavior like homosexuality and abortion, these Americans are outside the mainstream and often ridiculed. But in the 16 and 1700s, the most prominent ministers and leading Newtonian scientists believed that God still sent plagues, fires, and earthquakes to chastise countries for their sins. For example, John Tillotson, the future head of the Church of England, believed that because the English government had allowed the heresy of Catholicism, God afflicted the English with the Great Plague of London, which killed around 100,000 people. Tillotson also thought the Great London Fire of 1666 was caused by God because the English government had not learned its lesson from the plague and was still allowing Catholicism. It was not just leading Christian ministers who believed this. So too did prominent scientists. Samuel Clarke, a leading English mathematician and scientist, thought God would afflict England with the bubonic plague that was ravishing southern France unless all the English people repented for their sins. Another scientist who believed this was Carl Linnaeus, the developer of a system of classifications that is still in use. On November 1st, 1755, on All Saints' Day, the Lisbon earthquake killed about 70,000 people in Portugal. Linnaeus said that God had caused the earthquake to punish Lisbon for the many heretics the Catholic Inquisition had burnt in that city on many previous All Saints' Days. Besides God sending plagues and earthquakes, some leading Christians of the 1700s believed all the Africans were cursed to be slaves because their ancestor Ham had seen Noah naked and drunk one night. This was the cultural context when Herbert of Cherbury started writing the first deist book in 1619. Herbert despised this view of a wrathful God. He thought a good and fair God must have given a way for every good person to get into heaven. He turned to Stoicism, a major ancient philosophy, with its idea that everyone was born with certain ideas already put into their minds by God. Herbert thought that God had put 5 principles in everyone's mind that told people that God existed, and if they loved God and were good to other people, they would be rewarded after they died. Herbert of Cherbury knew the ideas in his manuscript were very different from those of his contemporaries, so he was not sure he should publish it. Herbert cared deeply about following God's will, and he also believed God answers people's prayers when they ask for help. So in his autobiography, Herbert described how he prayed to God for a sign about whether he should publish his manuscript, and he believed God answered his prayer and gave him a sign. Later deists shared Herbert's basic view of God. Prayer was also very common among the later deists because they saw God as a caring and loving Father. The best-known deist who believed in prayer was Ben Franklin. He called for the delegates to the American Constitutional Convention to pray to God for help in writing the United States Constitution. Franklin said that when the colonists were fighting the Revolutionary War, they often prayed, and God had performed many miracles to help them win the war. The group of deists who most emphasized prayer were the large number of French deists who supported and participated in the French Revolution. Over 100 of these deists, including a government official named Sylvain Fallier-Lejeune, wrote prayers or hymns to God. These prayers or hymns were often written in poetic form, set to music, and sung by large groups of people. Deists from Herbert of Cherbury in the early 1600s to Franklin and the French Revolutionary deists at the end of the 1700s all saw God as a good parent who loved all his children equally. He never favored the Christians by only letting them into heaven or giving them special treatment for taking communion or going to Mass. God also did not punish anyone who was not a Christian. The deists thought God only wanted people to love him, do their duty, and treat other people benevolently. The deists believed that developing a relationship with God did not involve any rituals or agreeing with official religious doctrines. Instead, building this relationship involved an inner attitude of reverence, love, and gratitude toward God. If people did that, God rewarded them in the afterlife, no matter what they believed in. In this book, I explain all these points, including how the deists were the first major modern group to be spiritual but not religious. I also explain other related points, such as how some deists, including Thomas Jefferson, thought Jesus' teachings were pure deism. Finally, I show that many people think a form of deism, moralistic therapeutic deism, might be the most popular religious or spiritual attitude in contemporary America.